Hi there. Susanna Jenkin. I'm recently qualified as a building surveyor, and I've joined building control in the short term. But I did my dissertation on how building control helps build quality homes, specifically with the aim to reduce carbon emissions for 2050 targets. But that aside, one of the main outcomes was that the house owner, the house builder, and building control, between the three of them, have joint responsibility, I think, for making sure that quality in retrofitting our existing housing stock, they work together to make sure that that quality happens. With this presentation, obviously, focus quite a lot on commercial aspects of quality. But do you have any sort of comments about the domestic sector, residential sector, and specifically the existing housing stock, and whether house builders and how house builders, small house builders, local builders, should take responsibility for ensuring that retrofitting to a quality standard can happen?
Well, I'll happily talk to you as the homeowner that's done it, and then I'll hand over to professional colleagues who've worked on the architecture side, if that's okay. In my experience as a client, it was an absolute nightmare working with a small contractor who didn't understand the different technologies and means of doing it or why they were doing it, and nothing got joined up unless I made it so as the homeowner. And I'm a semi-intelligent client. And I found it exceptionally difficult. So how someone who's got no connection to the building industry would lead a project like this, I've got no idea. You can, of course, appoint an architect as your agent, if you can find the right architect. But even with building control, it was really hard, because building control come in and they look at it at a point in time when things may or may not be hidden, covered up, and their job is to sign it off. So they'll either say it's right or it's not right. They won't tell you how to fix it, and they won't tell you whether or not it's the builder's fault, and then you get all the things about subcontractors and who's at fault. So I think for a national scheme, that's one of the reasons Green Deal was so difficult, because you're asking a householder to supervise something they don't understand with multiple contractors. So it was always going to be almost impossible to make that work. So do we need something for retrofit? Yes, isn't it something like 70% of the houses that will be built in 2050 already exist? And the houses we're building today will need to last 1,000 years. At the speed we're replacing houses. So good luck with that if you've got 1950s builds. They really are difficult to deal with. I'm going to hand over, gentlemen.
I think you raise a really, really interesting and an important question. So I think there are two elements I would take. One is around building control. So my experience in local authority working with building control in the early 2000s harked back to the recession in the late 80s and early 90s, where timber frame construction was gaining a lot of popularity for a number of reasons. But the quality of that timber frame, and that included existing properties, was so low because the standards weren't being enforced. Building control was simply swamped. The whole kind of baby got thrown out with the bathwater. And I don't think you can rely on building control as a quality standard. Building control there, in my view, it forms a compliance basis, which either works or doesn't, but is wrapped up with all sorts of commercial issues, with resourcing issues, and some real challenges. So I think the responsibility needs to come a sort of a step back. Coming to the point about existing stock and so on. We as a business have a massive refurbishment and retrofit program across all sorts of different scenarios, and then about energy performance and how you make the financial case for improving retrofitting, so the Energy Sprong program, for example. And making the financial case for that is about predicting quality. And it's very difficult to predict quality when, at the same time, new build products that say, oh, well, we can achieve this quality, don't meet those standards either. And I wouldn't want to say that's a failing of building control in achieving those standards. It starts much earlier, and a failure to articulate some of the financial implications of not achieving quality in the long term. Not just the financial, there's the obvious social issues as well. It is such a big issue, but beginning to look at improving the quality of life and places and the efficiency and connecting these things together, you can't look at one without the other. And so fundamentally, the performance of a product needs to be looked at in a lot closer detail by the consumer.
One thing I just say about regulations and standards is that we tend to they tend to be not something we aim to achieve, but something we just about scrape through. So, it's rare that a developer will spend money to improve energy standards, because as public house buyers don't tend to differentiate on that basis, so it doesn't happen. With space standards, if you're an architect designing housing and you're designing a one-bed flat for a developer, which needs to be a minimum of 50 square metres in the London design guide standards. If you design one that's 51 square metres, they'll tell you off, because you're making, they won't get extra return for that. So regulations tend to be a minimum. But actually, when you look at things like the Edinburgh schools, we're not, and certainly Grenfell, we're not even meeting those minimum levels. So I guess there's one thing that we need to get better enforcement of regulation. I think there's a whole conversation about how building regulations is managed at the moment. Can you do that through a privatised system? I think you could argue not. But there were issues to do with local authority building control that needs to be addressed. But nonetheless, if you put it into a market, then clearly you're going to get people. The people that get the job to do the building inspection are the ones that have provided the cheapest quote, and therefore are doing probably the least amount of work to check. So clearly that's got to change, to my mind.
So perhaps I can put a question back to you. We're talking a lot about sort of client side, and it's people won't pay for 51 square metres or whatever else. How much work have we got to do with client side, both house owner, both government and the agents that work for government? How much work have we got to do with them to get them to understand what quality gives you, not quality equals cost?
I think that's sort of what we're trying to do with the tracker, in a sense. It's saying that this is a badge, actually. If you're using this, then this is a differentiator. So you will be able to demonstrate in a fairly open way that you have had higher regard to quality than somebody who hasn't, because you can show how you've tracked it through the process. So I think we have to give clients a reason for wanting to do it. One thing we were talking in an earlier session, one thing we're saying is that, frankly, there are going to be clients, developers, who we are just never going to change their mindset. They are, the sort of rogue end of the business, where they are speculating quite heavily. But actually, there are plenty of very good clients who really do have an interest in the longer term, like ENGIE, and there are many others you could name, where they do have an interest in the asset once it's been completed. And I think that's where we can focus, and we're going to get better return on our investment if we do that.
So let's ask Chris then. Chris, how did you convince your C-suite that they needed to trial the RIBA tracker on the site at Rugeley? What did you tell them?
So quite simply, it's recognising value over long term, being very clear about what your objectives are. So being very, 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 very clear about, well, if you take it simply, it's quite easy for an energy business who's used to building power stations and operating power stations over a 40-year period to understand the principle of build it well, manage it well, and that makes you money in the long term, because a power station that goes offline costs an awful lot of money. So from the principle of what quality means and a sustainable investment model, it's relatively easy discussion. The point of value is about what period of time are you recognising value over. So if you buy, build and sell, you're always going to struggle with that quality dilemma, especially in an industry like the construction industry, where the lack of skills, some of the challenges around training, the procurement silos, all those end up putting a lot of pressure at the sharp end of the supply chain. So the challenge to really see what those long-term benefits are just goes.
So if we're looking at something like a new market, let's say design build to rent, and increasingly we're seeing pension funds investing in build to rent because they see it as a long-term return on a product that people are going to need for a long time. Do we think there's a quality agenda there that we need to intervene in?
There is. I don't think the market is fully sophisticated enough yet. So some of the big build-to-rent investors have a lot of metrics about life cycle costs around energy management. There's a lot of work that's been done, but some of those investment models aren't yet taking full account of the performance of the building. Some are beginning to, and certainly with some of the climate change requirements of institutional funds require that to be recognised. So increasingly, quality has got a commercial driver that recognises the value over a longer period of time.
And in terms of speculative buildings, I mean, the UK is one of the markets that's got more speculative building than most other European markets. Is there a specific intervention that we need to do there to stop the budget and run?
the right houses and the right buildings and the right places with the right infrastructure would be, so I think, this is where I move into sort of territory around talking about things like the Rainsford Review, which talks about an aspirational and a purpose-led planning system rather than a residualised licensing system. So again, how do you take stuff beyond compliance rather than just meet, as you were saying, Nigel. So, this debate about what do we need for inclusive growth, what do we need for economic growth, and how do we plan the infrastructure to promote that is simply a conversation that doesn't happen with anything like the coherence. And we often talk about the planning system to fail for that, and I don't personally. I think it's a failure of political dialogue for the things that affect our lives to be the decisions about the things that affect our lives actually reflected in Westminster or Town Hall. It just doesn't seem to connect.
Nigel, did you want to add?
I think if we're talking about the residential sector, it's very difficult for us to achieve these levels of quality with a sort of commercialised house building model. I think we need to see more being done by government and local authority. We've got the potential for that now. I don't know whether straying off the subject a bit, but now that local authorities can use their housing revenue and invest that in housing, then I think we would hope to see more of that, because they do have a longer term view, and they have the potential to build genuinely for affordable properties, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. But I think we need more from government and local authority.
Okay, so in the absence of questions from the audience, I'm going to ask one more of my colleagues here. You found a bottle on the beach. It didn't have alcohol in it, sorry, but you rubbed it and a genie popped out, and he's given you one wish to improve quality in construction in the UK. What would you like the genie to do for you?
Consolidate the planning and building control system into one homogenised set of regulations.
I think it's about procurement. I think we need to. I think you touched on alliancing and IPI earlier. We need to move to a different procurement model so that we can bring the constructors and the manufacturers into the process earlier. And I think if we do that, we're sitting near the off-site zone here. I think if we can change procurement, which has to come through government, they have to lead the way. Then we can change the way that we are building and using more modern methods of construction. And I think we've got a good chance of improving things then.
And I'd echo you with shared risk. I think you have to have an end objective that everybody shares, and you can't make money out of somebody else screwing up or proving that it's not your fault.